I've become interested in the early church. Now, I'm not unique. I'm simply following the crowd of other pastors and church leaders who feel that in this time of transition in the life of the church, it's important for us to take a fresh look at our roots. We're hoping to learn something by listening again or listening to the first time of the story of the church's very beginnings. So over the next 5 weeks, we'll be focusing on the beginning of the book of Acts, its first 6 or 7 chapters. And I invite you to read either that section of Acts with me or the whole book if you choose. Now, I don't honestly know what we're going to find together. I don't know the book of Acts very well. I've never had a reason to explore it other than cramming for a New Testament exam. But now, as I talk with clergy colleagues who are proposing cutting everything they can think of, from staff to mission, as national denominational offices are scrambling to keep their ships afloat, and as our 2 congregations have just finished our first year together as yoked congregations sharing a pastor, something we wouldn't have considered unless there was significant financial pressure, now I wonder, what was the church about at its beginnings? What was it focused on? What was it worried about? What did the people who were the church do? What were their lives like? The book of Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Now, we don't see this in our Bibles because the Gospel of John is in between, but they're a unit. They're both addressed to this guy named Theophilus. So the beginning of the book of Acts, it says, "In my first book, my dearest Theophilus," and that first book is the Gospel of Luke. This means that to better understand Acts, we need to keep the Gospel of Luke in mind. Now, in the beginning of Luke, when Jesus goes to his hometown to preach, he opens up the scroll of Isaiah, or I guess it'd be this way, opens up the scroll of Isaiah and starts to read words that tell us what his mission is going to be, what he's going to be up to. And he says this, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus is telling us what he's going to be doing, and he's telling us what the realm of God that he's proclaiming is like. Now, the year of the Lord's favor, which is what this all is really about, refers to the year of Jubilee, refers to the concept of Jubilee. Now, Jubilee is one of the most fascinating and radical concepts in the whole of the Bible. Jubilee redeems all of the weird stuff in Leviticus. So if you've opened up Leviticus and you're like, this is crazy. Well, it's not, because in chapter 25 you get Jubilee, okay? So in Leviticus 25, it declares that every 50 years there's to be a Jubilee year. And this requires that all debts are forgiven. So this meant if you were a slave, you were free. If you had lost your land, you got it back. After all, everything really belongs to God. So the modern equivalent would be, if your house foreclosed, you got it back. If you lost the farm, you got it back. Now, the flip side was true. If you were a wealthy person in ancient times, the bank of the ancient world, because you acquired lots of slaves or you acquired lots of land because people had gotten short or gotten behind in their payments to you, after 50 years, you had to give it up. Okay? Every 50 years, the slate was wiped clean, and everyone started on equal footing together. Now, scholars debate whether Jubilee actually ever happened, but it's there in Leviticus, and Isaiah and the other prophets talk about it, and here Jesus begins teaching about this and saying this is a part of the realm of God. So hold that thought for a moment about Jubilee. And we'll work our way to our passage for today. I have ragweed allergies, so this time of year is always scratchy throat time. So anyway, in Luke, Jesus does all these things that he says he's going to be doing, and then he's crucified because of it, and he's raised. God vindicates his message, and then he ascends into heaven. And then we have the beginning of the book of Acts. Now, Acts begins like a to-be-continued TV episode. It rewinds a little bit in case you're just tuning in. We go back just before the ascension at the beginning of Acts. And we have this conversation between Jesus and the disciples. And the disciples ask, is this the time when the Lord is going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Meaning, when will we be free again? When will the people be healed? When will there be jubilee, equality, a new start? Now remember, at this time, Rome owned everything, and everyone who was wealthy was in concert with Rome in one way or another, so jubilee sounded pretty good. Okay? Jesus says, patience, then soon you will receive the power of the Holy Spirit. It will come upon you. And then, whoop, Jesus ascends into heaven again. The disciples stand around trying to figure out what all this means, and then Pentecost happens. That's the underappreciated church holiday that happens around Memorial Day every year. Anyway, the Spirit falls on all of them, just like Jesus said. And the disciples start speaking in other languages. And there's a festival going on. There are people from all over the world around Jerusalem at this time. They hear the disciples talking in their native languages, and they think, well, those disciples must have thrown back a few too many wineskins, because they're doing crazy stuff. But Peter says, no, we're not drunk. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. This is the Holy Spirit. Okay? And then Jesus starts preaching about Jesus. And we're told that after Peter's sermon, 3,000 people are baptized. Peter's my hero. Every Saturday night I pray to God, please give me results like Peter. Okay, I'll just take 1,000. Maybe 100. Okay, just everybody listening. Okay? The Spirit starts the church, and thanks to Peter's sermon on steroids, now there are 3,000 people plus that are a part of it. And then we have our passage for today. So, if we're looking to answer some questions about what it means to be the church, here's where we jot down some notes. Verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Okay, more Bible study and fellowship. More snacks so people stay longer. And to breaking the bread, communion, maybe Wednesday night, potluck, and the prayers. Say grace before the potluck. Okay, these are our tips. In verse 43, all came upon everyone, because many signs and wonders were done by the apostles. Razzle-dazzle in the sermon. Then we have verse 44. Okay? All who believed were together and had all things in common. Here's where the pen and the notepad fall out of the hand. Right? But it continues. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Anybody want to skip with me to chapter 3? I remember reading this, or at least comprehending this for the first time in seminary and thinking, whoa, that sounds like communism, I thought. But if we read Acts in connection with Luke, we realize this isn't communism or socialism. This is Judaism, okay? This is Jubilee. This is a community living out Jubilee. The New Christ community is simply living out what Jesus proclaimed earlier in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus proclaimed the realm of God is going to be a beginning like a Jubilee year. He lived his message, was crucified for it. God raised him up. And then the Spirit empowers this community to keep living this message into the future. And they do. They follow the teaching. They're in intense community together. They eat together, living in community. They experience their common humanity with one another. They find that love has the power to eliminate class lines. And out of love and gratitude, those with plenty give their possessions to those in need. And the whole community gives what's left over to the poor. And they don't just give a little, they give it all. Now, I know this image of the church is in our New Testament. I know it's there. But every time I read it, it still surprises me when I think about what it actually means, about how people were actually living their lives. Now, just like Jubilee, scholars debate whether the early church was ever like this. Some experts say that this communal living and redistribution of goods must be just an idealized picture of the church. And that could be. But I also think that lets us off the hook too easily.